This week I made this coffee table, and as you can see, I got a little out there with the design and tried something a bit funky. I'm calling it the crop circle table. I've never used ash on a build before, but when picking out the hardwood for this project, I like the light, almost blonde color and the way the grain pattern stands out. And I thought it would give the carved wooden pieces a more cohesive look to have a strong grain pattern that is all running in the same direction, since these pieces will be embedded in epoxy. Speaking of epoxy, the pour did not quite go as planned. I'll show you what happened and what my strategy was for fixing it. Okay, right now I'm cutting down pieces to construct the two panels before carving out the design. I glued these two panels up and let them sit overnight, and then came back the next day and sanded them to 120 grit while removing any excess glue. For this build, I'm using my X-Carve from Inventables to carve out the design, but I think you could make a version of this coffee table using something like a jigsaw or a bandsaw. These carves took a full day to cut out, and when it was all done, I could cut away the excess wood using my track saw and then use a chisel to cut the tabs the machine uses to keep the pieces held down to the cutting bed. I got this Ryobi rotary tool and other Ryobi tools in this video as part of a partnership with the Home Depot, and this was the perfect tool to sand down the tabs and quickly clean up the edges. I moved on to gluing up these pieces, which I had to cut in two sections since it was longer than the 30-inch cutting capacity of my CNC. For the form, I'm using melamine, and I cut the main piece to fit this 2-foot by 4-foot coffee table. I covered the form in this sheathing tape, and the red stuff I used is called tuck tape, and I'll have links to everything down below. I'm just using brad nails to hold this form together, and this gave me a chance to use the 1-gallon Ryobi battery powered compressor I picked up as part of that Home Depot partnership. I sealed the form with a bead of silicone around the edges, and I'm happy to report I had 0 leaks during the pour. And a quick note while I get the pour ready, I had 2 cameras running to capture all the action because I had to focus on what I was doing during the pours, and I lost all the footage from my high view, wide angle shot when the SD card corrupted. So that's why you'll see these next steps only from that low angle camera setup. I arranged all the pieces in the form and used hot glue to adhere them to the form to hold them in place while I pour. And for this project, I'm using Total Boat's new thick set epoxy for the pour, which allows you to pour deeper and do a big project like this in just one pour. I started mixing the epoxy in a few buckets and then used the paint mixer attachment on my drill to mix these large batches thoroughly. Next, I added these pigments, and the blue and green you see here are both glow pigments that actually glow in the dark. I'll show you that later on. With the larger batch, I mixed in a black powdered pigment with a pearl white to give it some depth. And now I'll get to the pour, and you'll see for yourself some of the issues that I had. So my idea of keeping the color pigment separate from the black pigment went awry pretty quickly inside the circles. And then right here is where I noticed the 2 larger circle frames had floated up, so I had to act fast and resecured them with a few brad nails. At this point, it was pretty late at night, and I planned to get up every hour to check on the pour and give the epoxy a stir to swirl the pigments again. For the first few hours, everything was fine, but that 3rd hour things took a turn, and this is what I found. So what I've determined is that it was too hot in my shop to do this pour, and I only realized this after the fact. This caused the exothermic reaction to kick and harden much faster than it was supposed to, and this caused all those bubbles that you're seeing. Luckily, this was a pretty straightforward fix, although it was really messy. I used a router on a router sled to reflatten the tabletop, get everything even, and get rid of those sections that had bubbled up. This worked great, but it covered myself and my shop in a layer of epoxy dust. Okay, with that out of the way, I can move on to the base, and I'm using some 6/4 soft maple and a modern splayed tapered leg design. I cut and milled the pieces I needed for the base and cut in a 30-degree angle for the leg pieces. Next, I used this sled that I threw together real quick to cut an opposing 90-degree face to join the stretcher to the legs. And then I used a taper jig to taper the legs down to 1.5 inches. I assembled the base using dominoes, mostly because I wanted something quick, but I could have just as easily used screws and dowel plugs here. I also glued on the 30-degree offcuts to give me a 90-degree clamping surface while assembling. Back to the tabletop, I rounded the corners with a jigsaw and then used this Ryobi cordless palm router to add a round over to the edge. There was a lot of little voids left in the top from the bubbles I got pouring in my hot garage, so I decided to just coat the whole top with Total Boat's tabletop epoxy. Normally for a finish, I wouldn't go for a shiny epoxy coating, but I think it actually works on this table. And once that's all dry, all that's left is to attach the tabletop to the base, and I could call this project done. So I'd really love to hear your thoughts on the design down below in the comments. And I'll be honest, I'm not crazy about the way this table turned out. The original design was inspired by diagrams I've been looking at of the solar system, but I just succeeded in making a crop circle table. Okay, thanks for watching, and I'd like to take a minute to thank all of my Patreon supporters, including Ginny and Davis and Bevelish Creations, with a special thanks to my top patrons, David Britton, Matt Varughese, and DFM Toolworks. I couldn't do this without the support of my patrons, and there's info in the description on how you can join the JB tribe yourself. All right, thanks, and remember,